All right, today we are jumping right into the deep, complicated, and often brutal history of the Portuguese colonial empire. We're going to unpack how this whole enterprise was driven by this wild mix of religious fervor, the hunger for wealth, and, let's be honest, a ruthless demand for labor that stretched across 3 different continents.
And let's just kick things off with this quote, because it really stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? It's from Manuel da Nóbrega, a major Jesuit figure in Brazil. This one sentence just perfectly lays bare the core contradiction of the whole project. How can you be talking about saving souls in the same breath as justifying slavery? That's the tension, right there. And it's going to pop up again and again in everything we talk about.
So you got to ask, why Portugal? Why them? Well, back in the 15th century, Portugal was in a pretty unique spot. They'd finished pushing the Moors out of their territory way before their bigger neighbor, Spain. But if you look at a map, you'll see they were kind of stuck. Spain's right there, boxing them in. So if you can't expand over land, where do you go? You turn to the sea. It was the only open frontier they had.
So what was really pushing them out onto those waves? Well, it really boils down to these 3 big things, and they're all tangled up together. First, you've got commerce. They desperately wanted to get their hands on Asian silks and spices without having to pay the Muslim middlemen. Then there's the crusade. They had this idea of finding a legendary Christian kingdom in Africa to team up against Islam. And third, captives. The horrific but incredibly profitable slave trade. So yeah, you always hear God, gold, and glory, but a huge part of this story is really God, gold, and servitude.
And they didn't just talk about it, they did it. And fast. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, they pushed south relentlessly. For years, this one spot, Cape Bojador, was like this terrifying barrier they couldn't get past. But once they finally did, man, the floodgates just flew open. Before you know it, they're rounding the entire tip of Africa in 1487. And then, bam, just 10 years later, Vasco da Gama makes it all the way to India. The game had completely changed. It wasn't a dream anymore. Okay, so let's head over to Africa, because this is where the theory hits the ground. And what's fascinating and also really tragic is that the Portuguese didn't have just one playbook here. It wasn't a single story. What they did in one region was completely different from what they did in another, leading to this tale of 2 very different colonies. And this slide just lays out the contrast so clearly. On the one hand, you have the Congo. At first, it's all about making a respectful alliance. The local king even converts to Christianity. But that goodwill, it didn't last. The relationship soured, the Portuguese sent in the military, and the kingdom ended up as a vassal state. Now just look south to Angola. Totally different story. There was no pretense of friendship here. From day one, Angola was just seen as a place to get slaves. Force was the main tool for profit. 2 neighboring areas, 2 completely different and ultimately devastating paths.
And it wasn't any better over on the East African coast. When Vasco da Gama and his ships showed up, they found these powerful, established trading cities. Their way of saying hello? Cannon fire. They literally blasted cities like Mozambique and Mombasa into submission. The message was crystal clear. We're in charge now, and we'll use force to prove it.
All right, now let's jump across the Indian Ocean to Asia. Here, the Portuguese had to play a completely different game. I mean, they weren't about to conquer the massive empires of India or China. That was a non-starter. So instead of conquering land, they focused on controlling the sea. They set up this network of fortified trading posts, think Goa or Macau, to basically hijack the entire spice trade for themselves.
And you know, this whole new situation created a huge headache for the missionaries who came along with the traders. As they tried to introduce their faith into these ancient, powerful cultures, they ran smack into this massive question. If someone converts to Christianity, do they also have to become, well, Portuguese? Do they have to give up their own culture to be a true Christian?
And there was no easy answer. You had 2 totally different schools of thought, perfectly summed up by these 2 famous Jesuits. First, you've got Francis Xavier. For him, faith and culture were basically the same thing. If you converted, you got a Portuguese name, you wore Western clothes, the whole deal. Then you have Matteo Ricci over in China, and he did the exact opposite. He dove headfirst into Chinese culture, learned the language, mastered their science. His whole philosophy was, to win over the Chinese for Christ, I have to become Chinese myself.
This whole clash of ideas exploded into what's known as the accommodation debate, and people got really heated about it. These were big, thorny questions they were wrestling with. Like, in India, is it okay to work within the caste system if it helps you convert people from the upper classes? Or in China, when people honor their ancestors, is that just a cultural sign of respect? Or is it an act of worship that goes against Christianity? These were fundamental conflicts.
Okay, for our last stop, let's cross the Atlantic and land in Brazil.
And Brazil is a whole different beast. This wasn't about controlling trade routes or just grabbing slaves to sell somewhere else. Nope. Here, the Portuguese built an entire economy from the ground up, an agricultural economy that ran on sugar. And sugar has a massive, unending appetite for cheap labor.
And you can see the terrible logic play out right here. It started simply enough with trading a type of wood, but then the colonists realized the real money was in sugar. The problem? Sugar plantations are brutal, backbreaking work. So who's going to do it? First, they forced the local indigenous people into slavery. But when disease and resistance took their toll, the Portuguese just turned to Africa, starting one of the most horrific chapters in human history, the mass importation of African slaves. The sweet taste of sugar was fueled by a river of human misery.
And if you think the indigenous people just accepted this, they absolutely did not. They fought back hard. But the Portuguese response was just devastating. When the Tamoyo Indians rose up to defend their land and their freedom, 10,000 of them were killed.
And for those who weren't killed in the fighting, their fate was arguably even worse. 20,000, double the number killed, were captured and sold into the very system of slavery they were fighting against. The scale of it is just hard to wrap your head around.
But it is so important to remember that not everyone was silent. There were people who saw this horror for what it was. People like the Jesuit priest Antonio Vieira. He would get up in the pulpit, look the colonists right in the eye and tell them they were all going straight to hell for what they were doing. He was this incredibly brave voice of conscience, screaming into a storm of greed and violence.
So let's pull all these threads together now. We've been to Africa, Asia, and Brazil. What does it all add up to? The legacy is just messy. It's a story packed with contradiction, a story of how faith, something meant to elevate the human spirit, so often got twisted and used as a tool for empire.
When you look at the final balance sheet, it's pretty stark. The mission work, the saving of souls, almost always took a back seat to making money and grabbing power. For the Portuguese Empire, Africa was an obstacle to get around and a reservoir of human beings to enslave. The Orient was a series of cash registers protected by cannons. And Brazil? Brazil became a giant sugar plantation fueled by forced labor. It's an enterprise that produced both selfless martyrs and ruthless monsters, often sailing on the very same ships.
And all of this really leaves us with one big nagging question, doesn't it? The story of the Portuguese Empire is this massive historical case study that forces us to ask, when faith and power get into bed together, who is really in charge? Who ends up serving whom? And you know, that's a question that is just as powerful and relevant to ask today as it was 500 years ago.